Our expert presenters today will be Lawrence Sampson, President of Sampson Surgical, and David Merrill, System Engineer with Polarian. During this webinar, you are encouraged to ask questions via the WebEx Q&A panel, which should be viewable from the WebEx Event Center application. Your questions may be answered orally by the presenters during the webinar or in written form by one of the panelists. The webinar today will be presented in 3 segments, beginning with Lawrence Sampson, who will speak on design control, design and risk management, a practical implementation. David will then conduct a live demonstration in Polarian of the concepts that Larry has outlined in his discussion. At the end of the webinar, time has been allocated for Larry and David to answer questions received during the presentation. Thank you for joining us. I am pleased to introduce our special guest speaker, Lawrence Sampson, an experienced technical manager intimately familiar with medical device design and development. He has extensive experience in all aspects of the medical device commercialization process. Before starting Sampson Surgical, Lawrence held executive positions in 3 product development and commercialization companies. As founder and president of XS Engineering, he completed over 300 projects, managed a group of 15 engineers and product development specialists, and helped to bring several commercial and medical products to market. His client roster included Covidien, Medtronic, Gambro BCT, and Gates Rubber Company. His focus in his second company was predominantly the commercialization of medical products. He managed product and process development programs for both internal and external clients and supervised a diverse staff of biological scientists. Clients included Vectrant, Beacon Biomedical, and LabNow. Lawrence headed up Swan Valley Medical's product development and manufacturing operations. He managed the development of the patented T-Spec surgical instrument, oversaw the engineering and product development staff, and was responsible for all aspects of product commercialization for the company, including regulatory, supply chain, intellectual property management, and manufacturing operations functions. The T-Spec product is currently for sale in the United States, European Union, Canada, and Australia. Sampson Surgical is a consulting firm focused on bringing predictability to medical devices by providing structured design control services. Larry holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and an MBA from the University of Denver. He is the former chairman of the Colorado Governor's Small Business Advisory Council and winner of the Denver Business Journal 40 Under 40 Award. Welcome, Larry.
Thanks for that kind introduction. Appreciate everybody joining us today. Wanted to, I guess the plan is to cover a practical Polarian implementation of a medical device design control, and the idea then being to integrate the ISO 14971 risk management requirements as part of that implementation that, of course, are outlined for use with both the FDA and ISO. We have already, I think, got enough of my background, but just in the slide, if you need to get a hold of me, there's some information there with regard to email addresses and, that type of thing. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in, not assuming that everyone here is altogether familiar with the requirements and what design control is. Going ahead and we'll have a little bit of discussion just in general about design control. The definition of design control is that it's essentially an organization of the data used to prove that a design works, or in other words, the design outputs satisfy the design inputs. The process is defined throughout the standards as it's related to each component of the quality system. And the quotes shown here are just a few examples. For example, the organization shall plan and control design and development of the product, and of course, outputs of the design and development shall be provided in a form that enables verification against the design and development inputs. These are just a couple examples from the 1345 quality standard, but there are many more that describe how this kind of integration should happen. Just to let you know that it's a regulatory requirement and that the definition is relatively broad. We'll attempt here in this presentation to take a comprehensive view in order to set up our system to support all aspects and needs for tracking the device design as we go through the development process. Just as a point of reference, oftentimes, or a common misunderstanding is that design control and specification revision control are synonymous terms, and of course they're not. A lot of times when people think I've controlled my design, they've released their design into their documentation system, and then that constitutes design control, and it doesn't. Really, all revision control does is address our ability to avoid confusion in the system and build and design. It's only a part of tying together all aspects of the design. In addition to that, design control should and is required to tie risk management into the controls so that we're sure we're considering the harms to patients as part of the development process. Essentially what it is a proof and a loop closure. So what we're looking to do is provide a trace matrix that says what we're going to do, that it'll prove that we did it, and then assure that it stays done, which is where that risk or the revision control comes in. Just a brief discussion a little bit about why it's important. These are just 3 reasons, and of course there's more, but initially patient safety or risk control is a big aspect of this requirement, and don't want to assume that something identified as important in the design control, important to patient safety, was correctly addressed. We want to assure that that's done. We also want to quickly identify what was done in an artifact in an audit and be able to identify what caused that artifact or where it came from, and also what the progression was after it, so that we can quickly get to the data that we need as part of an audit. And you can imagine that in an FDA audit, they come in, and one of the favorite things to do is to start with your CAPA system, your corrective and preventative action system, determine what problem you have identified in your company that's wrong, and then drill down. And they end up someplace in the system, and you don't always know where that place is going to be, so you'd like to have a design, control, and risk management system that allows you to take wherever they end up and then back it out either into the patient, up to the patient harm, or into your verification testing for the design validation and verification. So just 3 good reasons to do that. And of course, that same methodology applies when we go to change the design. We want to be sure that when we make a change to the design, we don't break something as part of the development process. So we want to make sure that we have a traceability system that allows us to get to the tests that were done to approve it in the first place, so we can redo those tests and make sure we don't break something along the way. So those are the kind of that's the thumbnail sketch of design control. Now we're going to kind of get into how it is that we're going to organize the data. Plarion has an artifact which they term a work item. And a work item is a logical artifact with defined attributes. So essentially what we have is something that can be assigned a very broad definition, and examples of this in the control as we go along are requirements, test plans, and hazards. This is a very flexible definition in that we can add almost any kind of artifact that you'd like, so long as it's defined. And once the definition is established, then we can link those artifacts together with relationship logic. So it's basically a relational database, but it has this logical relationship logic that ties together the artifacts. And so some common different relationship logics are verified by or validated by causes, and really any kind of logical relationship that you can come up with is something that you can easily integrate into the system, so you can add it if you believe it's necessary for the purpose of keeping track of your design. So really the power of Plarion is in its ability to contextualize the work items in documents. And so instead, and you're going to, at the end of this, David's going to go through the Plarion tool specifically to show you how it's done in the tool itself. But what it allows you to do is have a document that describes, as an example in your product requirements document, you can describe the instrument or the medical device that you're developing. And when you do that, you always do it in the context of a document, and to make sure that all the areas are covered that you thought should be covered, and that, just as an example, you can define reference documents inside the document and not make them part of the logical definition of the artifact you're trying to define, or you can. So just as an example, a reference document might be something that you would define as a work item, and then you could associate it with a requirement to form the basis of an essential requirements list. That's not something we did in this presentation, but just as an example, it's a very flexible work item definition, and if you find in your process that you want to define something as part of your design control, it's certainly possible to do that. Product requirements, again, is one example, and in this example, the work items that I defined were user needs and requirements. And then the product realization plan, as another example, is related to all the processes required to make that plan or to make the device. So we have a process validation test and an inspection test work items that are defined in that document. So it's really a document-centric tool, which is altogether useful for the purposes of communicating with different divisions, especially if you have a big organization that's both, in different locations and multinational. So let's just talk for a little bit about how we would interrelate these design work items, and one potential way that you could do this definition that would satisfy the regulations. Essentially what we have is a user need. So what we're trying to do here is start with design inputs and then end in design outputs and then have a verification between those two. And that's really how this graphic is set up. The inputs are constituted by the user needs and the requirements. And the reason we set it up this way is the user need is a generic discussion. You might call it a marketing requirement, I've heard is another way people define this particular term. But what you want to be able to do is define it broadly without worrying about what standards would have to be required, how you're going to test it. It's really a place to drop what you need in the instrument from the standpoint of being able to sell it, but not have all the engineering background that says specifically what we're going to do. You might need to push the pedal hard or easy, but not have to worry too much about the specifics of what easy means. Then we have another artifact that's called a requirement, and the idea behind the requirement is it becomes truly a design input, that it is testable, that it's specific, and it refines what this user need is sufficiently that it fully defines what we mean when we say hard or lift. It's an attempt to refine that user need. So the design input then is the combination of those two things, the user need and the requirement. And of course, the requirements there's various different types of requirements. Safety, functional, or performance are just examples of that. But what you hope for when you're finished with the user need and requirement refinement is that you have a full set of auditable design inputs that allow you to write test cases against those requirements so that you can prove that the specification then would satisfy the requirement. In this case, we've also created several other types of work items that are a variety of different test cases, functional test case, process validations. Inspections are something that's going to be defined in order to do process control on the floor and or incoming inspection and first article inspections. And, of course, we also have some supplier controls tied in. A lot of companies have a multi-tiered supplier control system, and what they'd like to do is tie or come with a rationalization as to why a supplier of a particular component would be assigned a higher or lower importance in their supplier control and or a higher level or lower level of control, either contractually or certification-wise. So a lot of different ways for us to verify that requirement is met when we say that a part has a radius of 2 inches, that do it in a variety of different ways, everything from process validation and functional testing to supplier controls and inspection. So the idea then is, of course, the output is the specifications, and so this loop is tied out and the proof is completed by proving with tests that the specification or the output satisfies the requirement or the input. And so that's really how the overall control is designed from a design work-proof standpoint. So just a quick example of how this might work. The user need would be an instrument to be delivered sterile to the customer. So we just say, gosh, we really need this device to end up at the hospital sterile. We want it to be terminally sterilized, pre-sterilized before it gets to the user. And So the marketing department says it's going to come sterile, and then we say, okay, well, what does that mean exactly? And of course, what we want to do is split these requirements out so they're specific and testable. So we don't want multiple requirements tied out by one requirement. We want to have it's a one-to-many kind of relationship. So 2 examples of requirements would be EO sterilized with a minimum SAL of 10 to the minus 6 per the ISO standard that regulates EO sterilization, which is the 11135. And then another requirement that demonstrates the sterile package integrity is sufficient. And actually, I think the EN 868 is obsolete. I think it's been superseded, but you get the idea that we're trying to very specifically state not only what the requirement for the package is and also what standard it would be tested against so that it's easy for us to then loop around and make a test case. So a test case of that would be the EO sterilization piece would be a sterilization validation test, so a process validation test. Or you might have a shipping package verification test to tie out the second requirement. So just to give you kind of an idea of how this progression would work. So the second piece of this is really the risk. We're finally getting around to the risk proof. Typically, in a lot of different industries, you'd have a DFMEA risk analysis methodology that would start with, it's a cause and effect kind of setup, but in medical device, of course, we're more interested in patient harm or user harm. And so the methodology that we employed here is to start with the harms and then have hazards. And of course, it's a one-to-many relationship again. Multiple hazards can cause any particular harm. And then these same tests that we use in the V&V tests are mitigations to those hazards. So when we do a test and prove that something is going to function properly, we're also mitigating a hazard to the patient. So in addition to those tests that we were discussing before, we also have the user needs and requirements. So in other words, we can mitigate a hazard by changing the input design. And so what we want to do then is collect these all in one place related to the hazard that they can cause so that we can assess whether this mitigation strategy is appropriate or sufficient to mitigate the hazard that causes the end harm. And you can see how this would be a very powerful way for us to address if we had a adverse event happen in the field where we say, something happened, then we could go back to our risk analysis, identify the harm, and we'd immediately have a set of hazards. You'd immediately have a set of mitigations to those hazards, and it would all tie out to the testing in your V&V testing that you've done and or other testing that you did as just mitigations to the hazard, even if you didn't do it as a result of your design control. So, or, your design and development effort, not design control. So this kind of gives you a sense of the logic relationship between the different items, the harm and hazard and user needs. And just to give you a sense of how this propagation would work in a kind of a practical sense. I need to talk a little bit about RPLs. So when we're talking about the risk management, of course, what we have is, as part of our mitigation strategy, we need to assess the extent to which or the risk of any particular hazard. So what we have, and the way we start this process is we say, we're going to go out and do a clinical evaluation report. So the ideal way for us to do this is to look at devices in the field that are typical or something close to the device that we're in development on. Perhaps you even have a device that the company makes, and this is just an add-on. What you do is you identify the harms that device can have and then the occurrence in the field and use that as your initial harms list. And as we go through the development process, then what you'd start to do is process failure mode analysis, design failure mode analysis, and different types of analysis methods to identify hazards that are specific to that harm in our device. So you'd start linking in, okay, this hazard is associated with that particular harm, and build the process out as you go along. So when you're defining that harm, though, the severity really lies on the harm, because once you've defined what happened to the user, then that is the definition that defines severity. So our severity lives with the harm item. And then, of course, the hazard defines the occurrence and detection. So which is, of course, a matter of the embodiment of the harm, how it happens. So the occurrence and detection live inside the hazard. So we have this two calculated fields. One is a pre-mitigation. So if none of these mitigations were in place, what would we expect the occurrence and detection to be? And and then a post-mitigation, if we put them in place, what is the occurrence and how has it changed over time. Of course, in the standards, they talk about mitigations changing the harm, and I think what we talk about there is the harm doesn't really change. We just change which harm, which would be easy enough to link in and out, that the hazard causes. So if we do a sufficient mitigation, we may find that we can actually change which harm we're associated with, which is altogether easy to relink and change. So just to give you a sense of back to this RPL thing. So just as a side note, the method that I use for RPL or risk priority level calculation, we just have a table, and the table is defined by an equation. And for us, we use the severity squared times occurrence is equal to our RPL, and then a table that defines whether it's low, medium, or high risk, and I think this is a pretty typical way most people do it. The differences really come in how people calculate the RPL, whether they use, what kind of equation they use. Sometimes they use a pick list. Sometimes it's a severity, it's a straight product, severity times occurrence time detection. We felt that we wanted to emphasize the severity more to make sure in the design effort that we address things that are associated with patient harm more readily than how often it happens. So all this to say that it's really easy to make a change in RPL calculation method so that it fits whatever method that your company might happen to use. So risk control proof, this is just sort of a typical example. A harm might be the patient's infected by the instrument. Then you have I have just 2 hazards, but in the real case, there's 20 hazards that are associated with the sterility chain in a typical development. Sublethal sterilization due to uncontrolled assembly work area is one, and package compromised in shipment is another. So just as an example, a mitigation might be a requirement for a certified clean room or a controlled environment is vernacular. And then, of course, the test case would be the clean room process validation test, which is all the biology testing and different procedures for managing the test case. But really a powerful tool for layering in all the different hazards that are associated with a particular thing. And just as an example of documents that we're going to need, at some point in time they're going to want to, if it's an ISO submission, a tech file submission, you're going to have to pull out you're going to end up with a micro review of the sterility chain. And of course you could identify each one of these with an attribute, if you cared to, that said it's part of the sterility chain and that it would be easy for you to then do a sort of the product requirements document or the hazard analysis specific to that cause, which is a real time saver. When you get to the end of the project, you'd really like to just do a sort on attributes rather than trying to dig through all your documents and find the ones that you believe that they'll be interested in when they're doing the audit. So hopefully this kind of gives you a sense of how that cascade happens. So once we get all this together, each requirement essentially has basically 2 linkage paths. So when you start to this should hopefully give you an idea of the comprehensive traceability plan. So a lot of times when people are talking about traceability, they're talking about the design proof aspect of it. And of course that's important, but when you layer in the risk management, the reason we do it this way is we want to get to a place where we can contextualize the V&V testing with the hazards that it can create. So one of the questions that I've run into quite a bit is, if we're going to do a verification test, what volumes or how many parts, what confidence and reliability should I do the functional test case with? And I've heard all kinds of things, everything from you don't need to do it ever with more than one part because all you're doing is verifying something exists, which I wholly refute. But what you end up with is a situation, what you're trying to do in the end is assure that the design works and assure that a harm doesn't occur. And so when you're choosing what that test case is going to be, you really need to put the risk management on top of it to contextualize the V&V test so you don't end up doing all these tests twice to satisfy both your risk proof and your design proof. So hopefully this kind of gives you an idea. The requirement, as I was saying, has potentially two linkage paths. It can be a mitigation in the risk analysis trace matrix, or it can be a refinement of a user need in the design trace matrix. And so what we're saying here is that the functional test case is the same. You're using that same element to satisfy two requirements in the overall design control. The purpose of having the requirement, is to provide, okay. So that's basically what we. The next page is really a discussion of the documents, and this is a kind of a typical document set for the product development of a medical device. And the reason this is interesting is that the way Polarian works is a design artifact has to be defined someplace. It can be copied in multiple places, but the definition has to live in one of the documents. And the project plan, well, it actually doesn't even have to reside in the document, but from a logical development standpoint, it makes a lot of sense for it to be there. And so we have a project plan, which everybody understands the reason for that, but the product requirements document defines the user needs and the functional requirement, or the requirements including the functional requirements. And we did this harms definition in a standalone document for the reason that the initial definition of the harms comes from a document that isn't even initially tied into the design control. So it's kind of logical to put it in its own document. And then the hazards definition is also in its own document in order to allow us to segment that document into process failure mode analysis and design failure mode analysis, various different kinds of analysis methods. And it allows us to contextualize that hazard and explain where they came from and the testing that was done or the discussion that was done to define the hazard and where it came from. And then, of course, the product realization plan defines things associated with the creation of the product, so the inspection points, the supplier controls, quality management plan would be there, our process master validation plan would be there. So we'd have quite a bit of process definition with the items that are associated with the process defined there. And then, of course, we have our sample sorting. So the trace matrix are wikis, and what they do is they sort the data and display it in a way that it can be sorted and quality checked. And then, of course, we end up with a design verification validation test plan where all the test cases are defined. So just as an example, this is one way to set up your document stack to give you a logical progression with all these artifacts that have been defined. So the last slide here is a discussion about quality control. And one of the really great things about this is once you've defined these work items and linked them together, it's easy then to start running reports on the stack. And just to give you some examples of different reports that we can run, harm coverage is one. Do all the harms have at least one associated hazard? Hazard coverage, do they all have a mitigation? Requirement coverage, does each requirement have at least one test case? Now, this is all interesting from the standpoint of having some kind of an argument. It's useful to have at least one association made someplace so that you have some kind of an argument if you're audited. But in the end, the question is it sufficient? And, of course, the answer is no. Each line item then would need to be analyzed for sufficiency. Are the mitigations sufficiently good to lower the risk of the harm listed? So do we really believe that those mitigations are going to reduce the occurrence or not? And so in the end, also what you can run is a final report on quality control checks of each hazard as an example. So you could say, do we believe that this hazard has been properly mitigated, and get a quality control sign-off to be sure that we've ran the whole stack to be sure that management's looked or the design teams looked at each individual artifact. So really a useful tool from the standpoint of being able to sort just sometimes a ridiculous amount of data for errors and problems. So that's kind of the end of the thing. I'm always interested in improvements to how we might do this. So if you have any comments, I'd sure be interested in hearing them. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the presentation. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to David and let him show you Polarian in the native form. So.
Thanks, Larry. David will now lead us through a live Polarian demonstration. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Melanie, and a special thanks to Larry. It is not often that I get an opportunity to stand side by side with an expert in this kind of a discussion. And as Larry and I have sat on the table I'd like, around the table discussing these concepts, I'd like you to understand my role. I am a lowly system engineer. My job is not to be an expert so much in medical device manufacture, but to listen to the experts and help supply you with the kind of systems in Polarian that will allow you to achieve the type of design control that Larry's been talking about. Now, before I get started, we started out with a little bit of a poll, and I wanted to tell you that attending our seminar, our webinar today, are project managers, electrical and mechanical engineers. We have business analysts and system engineers all together. So each of you likely have different areas of both expertise and interest. And so it's going to be my goal today to try to touch on many of those in a way that reinforces what Larry's talked about. In fact, I'm going to try to go backwards through Larry's presentation, along the way touching upon key elements of Polarian, its function, its configuration, its workflow engine that will let you be able to bring your products to market in a way that allows you to defend an audit, to ensure the kind of safety compliance you'll need with ISO 14971 and others. So without too much more discussion, let me tell you a little bit about what we're looking at. Now today, I'm going to show you a couple of different Polarian projects. So if you can see my screen right now, you're looking at the Polarian user interface. Polarian's a Web 2.0 application, which means you don't have to have a client installed on your machine, and I can see the same thing looking at a Windows machine or a Macintosh or a handheld device. So we want to be able to bring this information to each individual stakeholder, whether you are a system engineer, a software engineer, deep in the trenches coding software, developing MATLAB or SolidWorks models for your devices, or whether you're responsible for bringing all the different pieces together, coming from suppliers, internal creation, manufacturing overseas. All of it needs to come together in a way that produces the products that you do. So my experience here is really coming from those Polarian customers that I've had the pleasure of working with. We are looking at right now a particular project. I'm actually going to move and talk more about what will be part of my demonstration context, and that is a fictitious project to create a bionic arm, a bionic exoskeleton for someone who can't move their arm. Now, it's going to be one of those projects that has significant mechanical equipment, significant electrical design, surgical design, and software manufacturing. And so in this mechatronics project, I should be able to, as Larry defined, explicitly create the document containers that are mandated to produce this product. So this is a landing page. I'll flex the window here. On the left side, you'll see throughout our discussion the different Polarian topics that I can go into. I'm on the home page of the bionic arm, and I'm going to dive deep into the requirements section first. Now, when I land on the requirements section, as Larry had discussed, I can have key inputs into here, like a project plan document that details exactly the goals of the overall product. I won't spend too much time on that, but rather dive into what I'll call the product requirements document, which was one of those key deliverables in Larry's control document diagram. So I'm going to open that up in Polarian, and when I do that, I'm first presented with this container, a document container that has very much a Word look and feel, but it's anything but a file. Rather, it is a container of key pieces of metadata, which in this case are going to be the high-level system requirements of my fictitious bionic arm exoskeleton, and starting to describe how that particular system requirement will break down into all of the other product components. So as I move down through this document, you can see quite easily, it's easy for me to attach diagrams and photographs. Here's an example of maybe the bionic hand prototype that we would build using available materials. And if I need to, I can attach embedded diagrams into this document. Along the way, as I make changes and save things, a rich history of all that I do is stored in Polarian. Now, my focus today is not primarily on what it takes to create this project and all of its components, but to see how this project under development could be impacted by the kind of hazard and harm analysis that Larry was talking about. So in this context, I'm going to step aside a little bit outside the bionic arm. We'll come back to this document in just a moment. But I'm also going to move over and show an example of working with another kind of Polarian project. This one might be purely a software project. So it's not mandatory that the kind of programs that you develop in Polarian have to be dedicated into all components. You could simply manage your software design for medical devices in Polarian, and the hardware and mechanical design and manufacturing happens elsewhere. And we can determine not just one particular project, but how these different Polarian projects all work together. So I'll go back and forth between those two, but now I'd like to move into really this context that we're talking about with respect to ISO 14971. And in the specification, it talks heavily about something called a risk management file. And while initially you might imagine that just being a set of file folders or paper, I'm sure you can understand the vast quantities of information that might be maintained if I did have to control that in paper or in file documents on a file system or in a SharePoint system. Polarian allows me to take all of these documents out of that stale and static context on file systems and really make them come alive as these work items that Larry was mentioning. Along the way, I can develop formal inputs like a risk management plan, which describes what I have to do to accomplish compliance within my projects. In fact, over here on the right, you can see some summary activities that I would be expected to do perhaps as a project owner to ensure that all of the people on the team, all the stakeholders are performing the necessary risk analysis from end to end through the whole life cycle, which begins in the earliest concept phase and continues till the end of that device. Well, let's see. What do we have here as output documents from this risk management file? Well, one might be the harms definition document, and that's one of the things that Larry had mentioned as well. So I'm going to open this up. And instead of describing requirements now, this might be coming from that industry study which shows me the different types of harms that might be produced by a product much like this bionic arm. So as an example, I have some soft tissue injuries. We have fractures and dislocations. This one we're going to spend a little bit of time on as an example, primarily because that happened to me 2 weeks ago. I dislocated my finger. So we're going to talk a little bit about that particular harm. And the harm can be as much or as little information as you need to supply. So I have some examples here of bringing in external documents as well as just textual descriptions in helping me quantify that particular harm. So this particular document can be easily modified. All I need to do is move into the particular device, and maybe I want to put in a more traditional layman's term here. And if I need to create a new harm based on additional study, it's quite easily done. I can just press enter, and a new work item, a new harm is ready for me to define and to modify. So let me continue just a little bit more into this. We'll say that there's also one possible harm. We'll call this a foot injury. And whenever I save this, a revision has been created, not just of this one new item, but of the entire document. So if you can imagine not just having David Merrill edit this document at one time, but have many different people editing the document simultaneously, you will be able to always see who made the change, when was the change made, and I'll always be able to compare the different changes between multiple revisions to see what the document looked like perhaps at a previous prototypical stage of the device and as I'm getting ready to release to manufacture. And this comparison can be viewed in a document-centric view like we see here, very much like a word track changes view of things that have been added and changed. Or I can break this down into the formal work item components and see exactly what different elements have been modified throughout the history of that particular document. So I'm going to go back to the current document because this is really just one part of our output. And I'll take us back to the risk management file here, and we can talk a little bit more about this. We'll talk about hazards in a moment, but also to bring out the concept that within this ISO 14971 project, I can also control DFMEA and PFMEA risk specifications as well, so they can exist side by side. Over here on the right-hand side is what I think is one of the primary differentiators with Polarian, and that is its workflow engine. Because a harm has a life cycle that's unique to a harm, it might be different than an FMEA risk item or different than a requirement, Polarian can allow you to establish whatever life cycle that particular work item type requires. And in doing so, there is an entire engine behind it to make sure that all processes are specifically followed with respect to who has rights to make changes, what other things happen in terms of those changes. Larry mentioned, for example, it could be possible to control not being able to say a harm is completely analyzed unless it has the appropriate numbers of hazards also defined. And to go even deeper, that those hazards must have at least one mitigating requirement or a mitigating work item to be able to say that that harm has been fully analyzed and managed. These are the types of process that can be built into the workflow. So as we also want to establish some information about the various hazards, I can have an independent hazards document. And this document can allow me to visualize those hazards, which in this case are fairly basic, and I'll be able to build and add hazards as necessary and link them back to harms. Let's go back to our risk management file for a moment. One of the key elements in our discussion was also being able to review and report on the quality of harms and hazards. And so what I want to be able to do is look at those harms that don't have hazards. So I'll click on a link that will open up a special page that will show me any harm that does not have a causation standard. And so I can go through here and find a harm to then do some work on. So I'm interested in this metacarpal phalangeal dislocation. So I'm going to choose now to create some associated hazards to that harm. And so I'll open this harm up and now have access to all the full attributes of this work item. So whether this is something that I would score as a risk severity of 2, or depending on how we as an organization choose to rate this severity, I can expand this list. Maybe I'll change this for right now, and I'll make this a risk severity of 3. And I have other attributes of being able to establish, is this a harm to the user, to the physician? Any number of custom fields can be established here. And so along the way also, I'm going to allow myself to create that causing hazard. What is it about this device that will cause this particular hazard? So I'll create a hazard right now, and I'll call this hazard, malfunction, a malfunction of the microhydraulic motor. Now, I can start to score some of this initial value. So, for example, how often will this occur? Well, again, on a rating scale of 1 to 5, perhaps I would figure that this would occur very infrequently. So I'll give it a score of a 2. And the detection, maybe the detection here, if I don't have any detection capabilities, that would be a very high score, a score of 5. Now, I have new occurrence and new detection values, which are meant for the post-mitigation phases. And I can apply additional descriptions here about the nature of the hazard. When I create this now, I'm not just creating a new hazard, but I'm creating a hazard which automatically has a traceable link back to my particular harm. And I would do this one by one as I study and analyze these harms and hazards. And instead of one hazard, I could expect to see, as Larry mentioned, 20 or more potential hazards linking to this harm, or perhaps a hazard which links to more than one harm. Now, that brings us to our next discussion here, which is to be able to visualize the relationship between harms and hazards in both traceability and risk priority levels. So I'm going to move on and talk specifically about now tracing the harms and hazards. So I will open up a harms and hazards traceability table. And this table is quite flexible. It allows me to break up several different columns. But here in the first column, I have details about all of the harms that I have defined. In the second column, I have all of the traced and linked hazards. They are all hyperlinked, so I can click on any one of these and I can go directly to that particular work item and take action on it. In the third column, I have all of those mitigating work items that Larry talked about, possibly a functional requirement which is authored to be able to reduce or eliminate the hazard, a test case to validate that that hazard doesn't exist in post-production, and possibly the same type of vendor controls, supplier controls, and process validations mentioned by Larry. I won't go into too much detail here in the interest of time, but I have the ability to create as many mitigating actions, and then those actions themselves are actionable within Polarian. And so my goal is to be able to take those actions, resolve those challenges, so that I can come back and say this hazard has been eliminated or reduced to an acceptable residual risk. So let me move down through some of these other traceability items here. And one of the things that we'll see right away is anytime I'm missing something, this tells me that I have a hazard without a harm. I have a harm. Because there's no harm, there's no mitigating action. So I have an obligation, a call to action, to make sure that that gets its appropriate treatment. In fact, down here you can see on my metacarpal dislocation, we have the specific harm or specific hazard that I just entered into. So let's now go one step further. We see the traceability. We see how we need to build this view which stays with me at all times, the view which is available to all users, whether I'm a system engineer, a product owner, or just a reviewer, possibly an executive approver and sponsor of a particular project. I can see these and I can infer the completeness of my risk analysis. But if I come back to the risk management file, and if we think back on what Larry mentioned with respect to risk priority levels, there's a third component here that I'm very interested in, and that's being able to display these harms and hazards in a way that bring out the scoring methods that we talked about. And so here we see an association of the harms and hazards, which introduces the risk severity attributed to the harm and the occurrence of that particular hazard and its detection. Now, based on the choice that you would make, perhaps you would choose to do the mathematical formula that Larry has implemented, or perhaps you would use a different formula. Those formulas are implemented inside Polarian, and they're something which are customizable by you. And so we can see here that I have the appropriate pre-mitigation risk priority level assigned to each, and I can visualize the mitigating items here as well. If I really want to see a little bit more about the mitigating items, I have flexibility in this page to expand the view so that I can see and visualize more of the detail of what these mitigation items happen to be. And ultimately, once I take these actions, I should expect to have a post-mitigation score for occurrence and detection, and necessarily a reduced risk priority level. So here is an example of a hazard, which is my device, which has a neural implant on the spinal cord, causing grand mal seizures. Now, those of you who are experts will understand that I've just said some things that make me not a medical expert. This is more of a layman's experiment and demonstration. But based on the completion of these functional requirements to reduce that hazard, that the neural implant overstimulates the nervous system, I've been able to reduce both the occurrence and the detection in my thought experiment so that I end up with an acceptable residual risk, which I would expect to pass on to my operators and users in the form of documentation and process and procedures so that the more serious risk is avoided. The goal behind all of this is to be able to link not just the hazard items that we see here, but be able to bring them back into the original project. So it's absolutely possible for me to visualize these particular hazards in the document level and move over and talk about the specific requirements here in my project and build links from document to document. So I would be able to say here in my hazards that the steel thread extending the finger is possibly a hazard which is going to be related to one of my higher level system requirements. So I'll be able to build this link right away in any Polarian view, and once I save all this information, it is part of the permanent traceability process. Well, I'm coming to the end of my time right now, so I'm going to move over and show you the final slide in our PowerPoint slide, and that is really an invitation for next steps. Larry and I will be talking about some of the questions that may have come in. I'll go back and review them in just a moment. So if you haven't placed your questions, please feel free to submit questions on the Q&A panel as I'm finishing. And I'll post another poll at the end here in just a moment. You're welcome to visit www.polarian.com, where you can view our medical devices microsite. You can try Polarian live on a test drive on one of our hosted servers, or request a formal proof of concept or a dedicated one-on-one demonstration that will be able to take some of these concepts that we've talked about into your particular environment so that you'll understand how you can customize them in a way that doesn't necessarily just fit my temporary example or even Larry's specific example, but it fits in your business model and in your particular area of interest. Let me now pause for a second. I'm going to go back and take a look at some of the question and answer panel, and in doing so, I'm going to ask Larry to also unmute himself, and I will be able to ask him the question and have him answer verbally as well. So one question was asked that it appears that in both presentations the risk analysis started with the harms and then identified the potential causes or hazards. Where or who identifies the harms to begin? Larry, could you answer that for me, please?
Sure, yeah, and I shot up a little note there for everybody too, but in my example and in my process, typically what I do is get a clinical evaluation report at the beginning of the process. So, and what the clinical evaluation report really does is go out into the field and look at either sister devices that the company is making or devices that are similar to the device that you're going to be making, and it identifies what those potential harms are, and also it identifies what the occurrence of those harms are in the field with devices that aren't your device. And that serves as a pretty nice way. As part of that report also, what you do is determine whether or not that potential problem that you've identified in the field is appropriate or what's the word I'm looking for, that it applies to your device. And so you pre-sort all that data before it comes into the development process. And that serves as your initial set of harms. And that really, what that allows us to do is pull harms into the design control process, so it acts as a driver to the design inputs, so we can start to think about what types of features you might need in your device to mitigate a harm that they're seeing in the field. And that always plays well with your tech file submission and or your 510K submission, because you've identified those risks already, and it's all part of your design control.
Thank you. The only other thing that I could add from a Polarian perspective, it doesn't matter if you begin with harms or you begin with hazards and link them later on. If we think a little bit, maybe not so much about hazards only, but if we think about the FMEA process, there's three major phases to that. There's the system FMEA, the design FMEA and the process FMEA. And the invitation, certainly in Polarian, is to begin this process as soon as possible with all the relevant information that you have. But you don't have to wait until the system requirements are fully built or functional requirements in electrical systems are fully established before you begin the process of examining potential failure of the system as a whole or the end harm to the patient or to the operator. Once a Polarian work item has been established, it can be available not just to one project, but to many projects. So it's conceivable that a harm that Larry has defined with his particular medical device could particularly apply to the device that I happen to be building. And so I don't have to create a second harm. I can actually transparently link to that particular harm at any time. And
it certainly doesn't mean that harm has. Yeah, that the harm doesn't need to be defined before, as far as the system's concerned. You could always start with hazards and push it up.
Exactly. Okay, so Brian asks, can you show how the RPLs are calculated in the wiki page FMEA? So Brian, that particular wiki page, let me zoom into that one. To show you exactly how that's implemented would probably be something that if you contact me via email at the end of the presentation, I'd be happy to walk you through it in more detail. But this particular page, let's pull
David, I'm seeing the splash page, not the.
Oh, thanks, appreciate that. So this harm and hazard page, which calculates the RPL, is using the equation that Larry established with severity squared times the occurrence. So detection doesn't factor in this particular matrix. And then once let's see, in fact, I may even have I don't have, I'll pull Larry's slide up perhaps at the end, but then it looks at the score of that value and then makes an assessment. Is this a 1? Is this a 2? Is this a 3? But there's several other different paradigms that we've encountered for calculating RPL. So this particular wiki page will allow you to pick an equation, a pick list, or even to be able to completely create your own formula. Now, if I could, let me also show another example in FMEA before I let this question go. I'm going to open up now a DFMEA risk specification, which is very much like, there we go. It's very much like the harms and hazards document that we looked at, but it's all contained in a single work item. And so here's the FMEA risk that the microhydraulic motor fails during arm operation. And instead of an RPL, or a risk priority level, this has an RPN, a risk priority number. And it has one before and one after actions. So if I open this up, you'll be able to see that to accomplish this, I can set the severity of a value, and I'll arbitrarily raise the severity of this, the occurrence, and I can pick from those lists of 1 to 10, which follows that pattern. And then when I save the work item, then there's a formula which calculates the RPN based on severity times occurrence times detection. So you can see that I can either create static risk priority values which are displayed in the work item itself, or I can make that more of a subjective view, which is looking at the harm that this hazard is linked to at the moment. What is the risk priority level of that at the moment? So it's all very tunable, very changeable. Thank you for that question. Okay, in fact, so the poll that I asked was whether or not people would like to stay on and talk a little bit more about FMEA risk management. And there's a few people who responded positively to that. So what I will do, with my thanks, I'd especially like to thank Larry Sampson for joining us, and also for Melanie for kicking this off. We will conclude the formal part of our webinar. We're just a couple of minutes over our 1 hour mark. I will stop the recording, and then I'll allow you to stay on, ask some more questions, and we'll take a little bit more of a closer look at the FMEA risk management and how that might apply. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. If you are interested in keeping tabs on this development, we will be releasing a formal template for Polarian that embodies many of these concepts that we've started with today in a much more extensive way to allow you to bring ISO 14971 compliance into your existing Polarian projects. We'll also be publishing a white paper which details in some of the concepts that we've talked about today as well. So thank you very much for joining, and I really wish you a very excellent day.